Come to shadow liturgy. There are paintings that should not exist. In the spring of 1865, as Confederate soldiers limped home through the mud-churned roads of Tidewater, Virginia, a collection of 17 oil paintings appeared in Richmond's most prestigious gallery. The works depicted biblical scenes rendered with such technical mastery that critics immediately compared them to Rembrandt, Caravaggio, and the Dutch masters. The brushwork showed an understanding of light and shadow that took most artists decades to achieve. The anatomical precision suggested years of rigorous academic training. The artist was listed as anonymous, but rumors spread quickly through the shattered remains of Richmond society. Whispered conversations in parlors, nervous glances exchanged at church socials, because people claimed to know the truth about these paintings, a truth so disturbing that gallery owners refused to speak of it publicly, that art collectors who purchased the works would later try to destroy them, that witnesses would carry the secret to their graves rather than speak it aloud. They said the paintings were created by a boy of perhaps 12 or 13 years, a boy who had been enslaved on a tobacco plantation 40 miles west of Richmond. A boy who, according to every person who claimed to have seen him work, had no hands. The stumps of his wrists ended just below where his palms should have begun. Yet somehow, impossibly, inexplicably, he produced paintings that master artists could not replicate. Paintings that seemed to capture not just the physical world, but something deeper. Something that made viewers uncomfortable in ways they couldn't articulate. The paintings vanished from public view within 3 months. The gallery owner died under circumstances the newspapers described as sudden and unfortunate. The plantation where the boy supposedly lived burned to the ground one night in July, taking with it any evidence of what had truly occurred there. For over a century and a half, this story existed only as fragments. A mention in a private letter here, a cryptic diary entry there. Rumors passed down through families who swore their ancestors had seen something impossible in those final days of the Confederacy. But recently, a collection of documents emerged from the estate of a Richmond lawyer's family. Letters, testimonies, a journal kept by a Union officer stationed in Virginia during Reconstruction. And within these papers lies the full account of what happened at Thornhill Plantation in 1865. A story of exploitation, obsession, and a deception so elaborate that it fooled some of the most educated men in Virginia. What you're about to hear is that complete account, the truth behind the paintings, and the real story of the boy they called Elias, and the terrible price paid by everyone who became entangled in the web of lies surrounding him. Before we continue with the story of Elias and the impossible paintings of Thornhill Plantation, I want to invite you to join our community of mystery lovers. Subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss stories like this one. And I'm curious, where are you listening from right now? Drop a comment with your state or city. I love knowing where our audience is discovering these dark chapters of American history. Now, let's step back into the spring of 1865 to a plantation that was already dying and meet the man who would orchestrate one of the strangest deceptions in Virginia's history. The road to Thornhill Plantation had once been lined with oak trees, their branches forming a cathedral arch that spoke of old money and older pride. By April of 1865, half those trees had been cut down for firewood by passing Confederate deserters. The remaining oaks stood like broken teeth, their new leaves struggling to emerge in the unseasonable cold that had gripped Virginia that spring. Silas Thorne stood on the columned porch of his plantation house and watched the road with the intensity of a man waiting for either salvation or damnation. He was 43 years old, though the war had added a decade to his face. His coat, once fine broadcloth, had been turned and mended so many times that the original fabric was barely visible beneath the patches. His boots were held together with wire. The plantation itself told the story of Confederate decline in miniature. The tobacco fields layout, choked with weeds. The slave quarters, Silas still thought of them that way, though Lincoln's proclamation technically freed their inhabitants 2 years earlier, were half empty. Most of the enslaved people had fled north with Union troops. Those who remained did so because they had nowhere else to go, or because they were too old, too young, or too sick to make the journey. Silas had been born on this land. His father had built the house in 1820, when Virginia tobacco still commanded premium prices in European markets. The Thorns had never been as wealthy as the great planter families, the Randolphs, the Carters, the Lees, but they had been comfortable, respectable. Silas had been educated at the College of William and Mary. He had made the grand tour of Europe in 1842, spending 6 months studying art and architecture in Italy, France, and the Netherlands. That tour had changed him. He had stood before Rembrandt's Night Watch in Amsterdam and wept at its beauty. He had spent hours in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, sketching copies of Renaissance masterworks. He had returned to Virginia with dreams of becoming a patron of the arts, of transforming Thornhill into a cultural center that would riv anything in Charleston or New Orleans, but tobacco prices had fallen. The Panic of 1857 had devastated Virginia's economy, and then the war had come, consuming everything. Silas had not fought. A childhood bout of rheumatic fever had left him with a weak heart, and the Confederate conscription officers had deemed him unfit for service. So he had remained at Thornhill, watching his world collapse around him while other men died for it. His wife Margaret had succumbed to typhoid in 1863. His 2 sons had never returned from Gettysburg. By the spring of 1865, Silas Thorn was alone in a house built for a family, master of a plantation that produced nothing, clinging to the wreckage of a social order that had already drowned. He needed a miracle, or at least the appearance of one. The idea had come to him in February during one of his increasingly frequent bouts of insomnia. He had been standing in what he still called the gallery, a room on the 2nd floor where he had hung the few paintings he had managed to acquire during his European tour. Copies mostly a mediocre Venetian landscape, a dubious Caravaggio that was almost certainly painted by a forger in Rome. But they represented what he had once hoped to become. As he stood there in the candlelight, studying the paintings with the desperate focus of a man trying to remember a better version of himself, an idea had crystallized in his mind with such sudden clarity that it felt almost like divine inspiration. He would create an artist, not train one. That would take years he didn't have, not hire one. He had no money to pay. He would create the illusion of an artist, a prodigy so remarkable, so impossible that collectors would pay extraordinary sums just to own a piece of the mystery. And he knew exactly how to make the story irresistible. The boy had arrived at Thornhill in 1861, part of a group of 12 enslaved P.E. Opal Silas had purchased at auction in Richmond. The seller had been eager to liquidate assets before fleeing to Europe, and Silas had gotten them for a fraction of their usual price. The boy had been perhaps 9 years old then, small for his age, with large, dark eyes that seemed to absorb everything around him. His name, according to the bill of sale, was Elias. No surname, no family history. The auction record noted only one distinguishing characteristic: hands missing below wrists, injury occurred, age 4, cause unknown, otherwise healthy, reduced price. Silas had barely noticed him at first. The boy had been assigned to work in the kitchen gardens, tasks he could manage despite his disability. He used the stumps of his wrists with surprising dexterity, wedging tools between them, learning to grip and manipulate objects in ways that seemed impossible until you watched him do it. But Silas had noticed something else about Elias over the years. The boy was always watching. When Silas sat on the porch reading, Elias would find reasons to work nearby, his eyes flickering toward the pages. When Silas had his remaining paintings brought down for cleaning, Elias would stand motionless in the hallway, staring at them with an intensity that seemed almost hungry. One afternoon in 1863, Silas had found drawings scratched into the dirt floor of the kitchen garden shed. They were crude, executed with a stick held between the stumps of Elias's wrists, but they showed an understanding of perspective and proportion that was remarkable for anyone, let alone an untrained child working with such limitations. Silas had said nothing, but he had remembered. Now, standing on his porch in the cold April dawn of 1865, watching the road for the visitor he had summoned, Silas thought about those drawings. He thought about the paintings mouldering in his gallery, and he thought about the one person on the plantation who might be able to help him execute his plan. Her name was Lena. She was 26 years old, and she had been born on Thornhill Plantation. Her mother had been a house servant. Her father had been Silas's father, though this was never acknowledged aloud. Lena had grown up in the twilight world of mixed-race children on southern plantations, neither fully enslaved nor fully free, granted small privileges that could be revoked at any moment, always aware that her existence was a reminder of something shameful. Margaret Thorne had hated her, had made her life as difficult as possible within the constraints of plantation propriety. But Margaret was dead now, and Lena remained. Lena could read and write, skills taught to her secretly by Silas's mother before the old woman's death. More importantly, Lena could paint. Silas had discovered this by accident 5 years earlier, when he had found her in the gallery late one night, a candle burning beside her, carefully copying one of his paintings onto a piece of salvaged canvas, using paints she had mixed herself from crushed berries and clay. He should have punished her. Instead, he had been fascinated. Her copy was crude, but showed genuine understanding of technique. Over the following months, he had begun leaving painting supplies where she could find them, watching from a distance as she taught herself through trial and error, never speaking of it directly, but allowing it to continue. Now he was going to use that skill, use her, use Elias, use everything and everyone at his disposal to create something that would save him from complete ruin. A horse appeared on the road. The rider was a Union officer, his blue uniform stark against the grey morning. This was the visitor Silas had been expecting. Captain James Whitfield, stationed in Richmond as part of the occupying force, responsible for documenting Confay. Dear property for potential seizure. Silas had written to him 3 weeks earlier with a proposition. He had something of value to show the captain, something that might interest the Union authorities, something that could benefit them both. As the captain dismounted and climbed the porch steps, Silas forced his face into an expression of defeated courtesy. He had rehearsed this moment carefully. Everything depended on the performance. "Captain Whitfield," he said, extending his hand, "thank you for coming. I have something extraordinary to show you, something that I believe will change both of our fortunes." The captain's expression was skeptical, but he followed Silas into the house, into the trap that was about to be sprung, into the beginning of a deception that would consume them all. The gallery on the second floor smelled of mildew and old canvas. Dust motes swirled in the weak sunlight filtering through windows that hadn't been properly cleaned in 2 years. Captain Whitfield stood in the center of the room, his hands clasped behind his back, studying the paintings on the walls with the polite disinterest of a man who had been promised something extraordinary and was preparing to be disappointed. "These are your collection?" he asked. His voice carried the flat vowels of Ohio. "These?" Silas waved dismissively at the paintings. "No, Captain, these are merely the remnants of better days. What I want to show you is something else entirely, something that has only recently come to my attention." He had prepared the room carefully over the past 3 weeks. The paintings he was about to reveal had been created in the plantation's old smokehouse, which Silas had converted into a makeshift studio. Lena had worked there every night by candlelight, following Silas's detailed instructions. He had selected the subjects carefully, biblical scenes that would appeal to the religious sensibilities of the era, but rendered with a darkness and psychological intensity that would make them memorable. There were 5 paintings in total, each approximately 3 feet x 4 feet. Silas had aged them artificially using techniques he remembered from his time in Italy, where he had watched forgers at work. Tobacco smoke to yellow the varnish, careful application of dirt to the edges, strategic cracking of the paint surface, but the paintings themselves were genuine. Lena had created them, working from prints and descriptions Silas provided, channeling everything she had taught herself over 5 years of secret practice. They were not masterpieces. Silas knew that. But they were good, very good. Good enough to fool most people, especially when combined with the story he was about to tell. "I discovered these paintings 3 weeks ago," Silas said, his voice taking on the tone of a man sharing a confidence. "They were hidden in a storage room that hadn't been opened in years. At first I thought they might be works my father had acquired and forgotten. But then I made inquiries, showed sketches to some of the older servants who have been here since before I was born." He paused, letting the silence build. Captain Whitfield had turned to look at him, his interest finally engaged. "And what did they tell you?" the captain asked. "They told me about a boy," Silas said. "An enslaved child who arrived here 4 years ago. A boy with no hands, Captain. His wrists end in stumps. Yet according to these servants, they have seen this boy create paintings. They've watched him work, holding brushes between his wrists, producing art that seems impossible given his condition." The lie flowed smoothly. Silas had practiced it until he could deliver it with perfect conviction. The truth was more complicated, more carefully orchestrated, but the captain didn't need to know that. "That's impossible." "Blay," Whitfield said flatly. "I would have said the same thing," Silas replied, "until I saw it myself." This was the crucial moment, the point where the deception had to become real, at least in appearance. Silas had spent weeks preparing Elias for this performance, teaching him to stand in certain positions, to move in certain ways, to remain silent, and let the adults around him construct whatever narrative they wanted. "Would you like to meet him?" Silas asked. 10 minutes later they stood in the old smokehouse. Silas had transformed it over the past month, clearing out the hanging racks, whitewashing the walls, installing a large table that could serve as an easel. The room smelled of linseed oil and turpentine now, instead of cured meat. Elias stood beside the table. He was taller than he had been in 1861, but still small for his age, with the thin frame of someone who had never quite gotten enough to eat. He wore clean clothes. Silas had insisted on that. His wrists were clearly visible, the stumps ending just below where his hands should have begun. The skin there was smooth, long-heeled, the bones beneath creating small, rounded protrusions. The boy's face was carefully neutral. Silas had coached him on this as well. "Show nothing. Let them project whatever they want onto you. Be a blank canvas." On the table before Elias was a painting in progress. It depicted the biblical scene of Judith beheading Holofernes, rendered in the dramatic chiaroscuro style of Caravaggio. The painting was perhaps half finished, the figures emerging from darkness with theatrical intensity. Captain Whitfield stared. His mouth had fallen slightly open. "Show the captain how you work," Silas said gently to Elias. What happened next was the result of 3 weeks of careful rehearsal. Elias picked up a brush, wedging it between the stumps of his wrists in a grip that looked awkward but functional. He leaned over the canvas. His movements were slow, deliberate, each gesture carefully practiced. He made 3 strokes on the canvas. They were crude, imprecise, nothing like the sophisticated work visible in the rest of the painting. But they were strokes, visible proof that the boy could manipulate a brush. Then Silas stepped forward. "That's enough for now," he said, gently taking the brush from Elias. "He tires quickly. The work is very demanding." The captain was still staring. "How is this possible?" he whispered. "I don't know," Silas said. "And this at least was partially true. I've watched him work for hours. It's as if the disability has forced him to develop abilities the rest of us don't possess, as if losing his hands has somehow sharpened his other senses, his spatial understanding, his ability to visualize and execute." It was nonsense, of course, beautiful, compelling nonsense, designed to appeal to Victorian sentiments about suffering and transcendence, the idea that disability might confer special gifts, that God might compensate for physical loss with spiritual or artistic elevation. But Captain Whitfield was nodding slowly, his mind already constructing a narrative that made sense of what he thought he was seeing. "The paintings I showed you upstairs," Silas continued, "those were his early works created over the past year. I only discovered them recently because I had forbidden him from painting. I thought it was a waste of time, a distraction from his duties, but he continued in secret, hiding the finished works in storage. Another lie, smooth as silk. The paintings had been created by Lena over the past 3 weeks, but Silas delivered the falsehood with such conviction that even he almost believed it. "I've come to realize," Silas said, his voice taking on a tone of reluctant revelation, "that this boy may be one of the most remarkable artistic talents in America. Perhaps in the world, and I believe his work deserves to be seen, to be recognized, to be preserved." He let the implications hang in the air. Captain Whitfield was an educated man. He would understand what Silas was really proposing. "You want to sell them?" the captain said. "I want to share them," Silas corrected. "For appropriate compensation, of course. The war has left me in difficult circumstances, Captain, I'm sure you understand. But more than that, I believe these paintings represent something important, a story of human triumph over adversity, the kind of story that people need right now as the nation begins to heal. It was masterful manipulation, wrapping greed in the language of noble purpose, and Silas could see it working, could see the captain's expression shifting from skepticism to fascination to calculation. "I would need to verify this," Whitfield said slowly. "Bring in experts, have them examine the paintings, and observe the boy working." "Of course," Silas agreed. "I welcome scrutiny. The truth speaks for itself." But even as he said it, Silas was already planning how to manage that scrutiny, how to control what the experts saw, how to ensure that the deception remained intact. Because the truth was far more complicated than what Captain Whitfield thought he had witnessed. The truth involved not just Elias and his carefully rehearsed performance, but Lena working in secret. It involved a system of signals and timing that Silas had orchestrated with obsessive precision. It involved the exploitation of not one but two people, both of whom had no choice but to participate in Silas's scheme. And it involved a level of cruelty that Silas had not fully acknowledged to himself. Because to make the deception work, he needed Elias to be present, needed him to be seen, needed him to perform his small, carefully practiced gestures, while the real work happened elsewhere. Here, out of sight. He needed Elias to be complicit in his own exploitation, to understand that his survival and Lena's survival depended on maintaining the lie. As Captain Whitfield left that afternoon, promising to return within the week with art experts from Richmond, Silas stood in the smokehouse and looked at Elias. The boy's face was still neutral, but his eyes held something that made Silas uncomfortable. Not accusation exactly, not even resentment, just a kind of watchful awareness that suggested Elias understood far more than Silas wanted him to. "You did well," Silas said quietly. "Keep doing exactly as I've taught you, and everything will be fine. You and Lena will be taken care of, I promise." Elias said nothing. He simply nodded once and left the smokehouse, his footsteps silent on the dirt floor. Silas remained alone in the room, surrounded by paintings that Lena had created, that he was claiming as Elias's work, that he planned to sell to the highest bidder. He told himself he was doing what was necessary, that survival required compromise, that the ends justified the means. But standing there in the smell of paint and turpentine, he felt the first cold touch of something that might have been guilt or might have been fear, the sense that he had set something in motion that he might not be able to control, that the lie he had constructed was more fragile than he wanted to believe. He pushed the feeling aside. There was too much at stake to doubt now, too much to lose. He would make this work. He had to. Outside, the sun was setting over the ruined tobacco fields, painting the sky the color of old blood. And in the slave quarters, Lena sat on the edge of her narrow bed, staring at her paint-stained hands, wondering how long she could sustain the impossible pace Silas was demanding, wondering what would happen when the deception inevitably collapsed. Wondering. And she, if anyone would believe her if she tried to tell the truth. The experts arrived on a Thursday morning, 6 days after Captain Whitfield's initial visit. There were 3 of them. Dr. Edmund Hartley, a professor of art history from the College of William and Mary. Mr. Charles Brennan, a portrait painter of some reputation in Richmond society, and Mrs. Abigail Sutton, a wealthy widow who fancied herself a patron of the arts and had financed the expedition out of curiosity. Silas had spent those 6 days in a state of controlled panic, refining every detail of the deception. He had coached Elias through dozens of additional rehearsals, teaching him to hold brushes at different angles, to lean over canvases with convincing concentration, to execute simple strokes that looked deliberate rather than random. He had worked with Lena to create 3 additional paintings, pushing her to work faster than was safe or sustainable, ignoring her exhaustion and the trembling in her hands. The new paintings depicted more biblical scenes: David and Goliath, Daniel in the lion's den, and the sacrifice of Isaac. Silas had chosen subjects that emphasized drama and emotional intensity, scenes that would showcase technical skill while also telling stories that Victorian audiences found morally edifying. Lena had worked through the nights, sleeping only a few hours before dawn. Her eyes had developed dark circles. Her hands cramped so badly that she sometimes had to stop and massage them for minutes before she could continue, but she said nothing. She knew, as Elias knew, that their survival depended on Silas's success. The plantation operated on a careful schedule. Now, during the day, Elias would be brought to the smokehouse, where he would sit beside paintings in various stages of completion. He would hold brushes, make small, careful marks on the canvas, perform the pantomime of creatio, while Silas watched and offered gentle encouragement. At night, after Silas had retired to the main house, Lena would slip into the smokehouse through a back entrance. She would work by candlelight, her movements quick and precise, adding the details and sophistication that transformed Elias's crude marks into something that resembled professional art. She would paint for 4 or 5 hours, then carefully clean her brushes, hide any evidence of her presence, and return to her quarters before dawn. It was exhausting, it was unsustainable, but it was working. Dr. Hartley was a thin man in his 60s, with wire-rimmed spectacles and the permanently skeptical expression of someone who had spent his career studying forgeries and false attributions. He examined the paintings in the gallery with meticulous attention, using a magnifying glass to study brushstrokes, checking the backs of canvases for signs of artificial aging, even scraping tiny samples of paint to examine their composition. "The technique is remarkable," he said finally, his voice carrying a note of reluctant admiration. "The use of chiaroscuro shows clear influence from the Italian Baroque masters. The anatomical precision suggests formal training." And yet, he trailed off, his expression troubled. "And yet," Silas prompted, his heart hammering. "And yet there are inconsistencies." Hartley continued, "The brushwork varies significantly between paintings. Some areas show extraordinary confidence and skill, while others seem almost hesitant, as if different hands worked on different sections." Silas had prepared for this. "The boy's condition makes his work unpredictable," he said smoothly. "Some days he has better control than others. The pain in his wrists varies. His energy fluctuates. It's part of what makes his achievement so remarkable. He's working against constant physical limitations." It was a good answer, and Silas could see Hartley considering it. The professor wanted to believe. They all did. The story was too compelling, too perfect for the moment. A formerly enslaved child, disabled, creating art that rivaled the masters. It was exactly the kind of narrative that would resonate in the aftermath of the Civil War, a story of redemption and transcendence that could help a fractured nation believe in the possibility of healing. "I'd like to observe him working," Hartley said extensively, "over several days if possible." "Of course," Silas agreed, though his stomach clenched with anxiety. "He works in the old smokehouse. I've converted it into a studio for him. You're welcome to watch for as long as you like." The observation began that afternoon. Silas brought Elias to the smokehouse, where a canvas had been prepared with a rough charcoal sketch of the Annunciation, the angel Gabriel appearing to Mary. It was a subject Silas had chosen carefully, one that required technical skill, but also offered opportunities for emotional subtlety. The 3 experts arranged themselves around the room, maintaining a respectful distance, but watching intently. Elias stood before the canvas, a brush wedged between his wrists. He had been given detailed instructions that morning about what to do, what sequence of movements to perform. He began to paint. The strokes were slow, deliberate. He worked on the angel's wing, adding touches of white to suggest light catching on feathers. The movements looked awkward but purposeful. He would pause frequently, stepping back to study the canvas, then lean in again to add another careful mark. It was convincing. Silas had made sure of that. The key was that Elias wasn't actually creating the painting. He was embellishing work that Lena had already substantially completed the night before. The underlying composition, the sophisticated modeling of form, the SUE, BTLE color harmonies, all of that was already there. Elias was simply adding surface details, touches that required minimal skill, but created the impression of active creation. Dr. Hartley watched for 3 hours. Mr. Brennan made sketches of Elias's technique. Mrs. Sutton sat in a corner, her handkerchief pressed to her mouth, tears streaming down her face at the beauty and powers of what she believed she was witnessing. "It's extraordinary," Brennan whispered to Hartley. "I've never seen anything like it. The way he compensates for his disability, it's as if he's developed an entirely new approach to painting." "The question," Hartley said quietly, "is whether what we're seeing is genuine artistic creation, or merely the final touches on work completed by someone else." Silas's blood went cold. But before he could respond, Mrs. Sutton spoke up, her voice sharp with indignation. "How can you doubt what's right before your eyes?" she demanded. "Look at the boy. Look at his concentration, his dedication." "Are you suggesting this is some kind of trick?" "I'm suggesting we need to be thorough," Hartley replied calmly. "Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence." "Then let's provide that evidence," Silas said, forcing confidence into his voice. "Let the boy start a painting from scratch, a blank canvas. You choose the subject. Watch him from the very beginning." It was a calculated risk, but Silas had no choice. Hartley's skepticism was dangerous. If the professor left unconvinced, he could poison the entire enterprise. Better to double down on the deception to create a situation where the experts felt they had controlled every variable. Hartley's eyes narrowed. "Very well," he said. "Tomorrow morning, a blank canvas. I'll provide the subject at that time, and I want to observe continuously from first stroke to completion." That night, Silas met with Lena in the smokehouse. She looked exhausted, her eyes red-rimmed, her hands trembling slightly as she mixed paints. "They want to watch a painting created from start to finish," Silas said without preamble. "Tomorrow. Hartley will choose the subject in the morning." Lena's face went pale. "That's impossible. I can't work with them watching, and Elias can't create a painting on his own, you know that." "I know," Silas said, "which is why we need a different approach." He had been thinking about this possibility for days, developing contingency plans. Now, he explained his idea to Lena, watching her expression shift from fear to disbelief to reluctant understanding. The plan was more elaborate than anything they had attempted before. It would require split-second timing, careful misdirection, and a level of coordination between Elias and Lena that they had never needed previously. But it might work. It had to work. "You're asking too much," Lena said quietly. "This is going to fall apart, and when it does, it won't fall apart," Silas interrupted. "Not if we're careful. Not if everyone does exactly what I tell them." "And if I refuse?" Lena asked. There was no defiance in her voice, only exhaustion and a kind of hopeless curiosity. Silas looked at her for a long moment. They both knew the answer. She couldn't refuse. She had no power to refuse. Her existence at Thornhill depended entirely on Silas's tolerance. If she refused to cooperate, he could make her life unbearable in 1,000 small ways, or he could simply force her to leave, to strike out on her own in a Virginia that was still hostile to freed slaves, especially women traveling alone. "You won't refuse," Silas said softly, "because you're smart enough to understand that this is the best option for everyone. If this works, if we can sell these paintings for the prices I think they'll command, there will be money, real money, enough to secure your future, enough to buy land, start a new life somewhere else." It was a lie, or at least a half-truth. Silas had no intention of sharing significant proceeds with Lena, but he needed her to believe it, needed her to stay motivated for just a little longer. Lena said nothing. She simply turned back to her paints. Her shoulders slumped in defeat. Silas left her there and walked back to the main house through the darkness. The night was cold and clouds obscured the stars. Somewhere in the distance an owl called the sound lonely and forlorn. He told himself again that he was doing what was necessary, that survival in this new world required ruthlessness and creativity, that the exploitation of Lena and Elias was no different from what every other plantation owner had done for generations. He was simply adapting the system to new circumstances. But the guilt was growing harder to ignore. It sat in his chest like a stone, heavy and cold. He tried to push it away to focus on the practical details of tomorrow's performance, but it lingered. In her quarters, Lena sat on her bed and stared at her hands. They were her father's hands, long-fingered and elegant. They were also her mother's hands, strong and capable. They were the hands that had taught themselves to paint through years of secret practice, the hands that were now being used to perpetrate a fraud. She thought about refusing, about walking away from Thornhill and never looking back. But where would she go? What would she do? The war had freed the slaves legally, but it hadn't created opportunities or safety. Virginia was still dangerous for black people, especially women. The Freedmen's Bureau was overwhelmed. Jobs were scarce. Violence was common, so she would continue. She would paint through the night, creating art that would be attributed to someone else. She would be complicit in her own erasure because the alternative was worse. In the smokehouse, Elias lay on a pallet Silas had provided for him. He was supposed to sleep there now to be available at all times for the expert's observation. He stared at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the night, thinking about the performance he would have to give tomorrow. He understood more than Silas realized. He had always been observant, always watching and learning. He knew that Lena was the real artist. He knew that his role was to be a prop, a convincing illusion. He knew that Silas was using both of them, but he also knew something else. He knew that this deception, as cruel and exploitative as it was, had given him a kind of power. People were paying attention to him. Important people. People who might be able to help him if he could find a way to communicate the truth. He was 12 years old, and he was already learning to think strategically, to plan, to wait for the right moment. That moment hadn't come yet, but it would. He was sure of it. As the night deepened and the temperature dropped, 3 people lay awake in different parts of Thornhill Plantation, each trapped in their own way by Silas Thorne's ambition, each waiting for tomorrow when the deception would either succeed spectacularly or collapse entirely. And in Richmond, 40 miles away, rumors were already spreading. Whispers about a miraculous boy artist, stories that grew more elaborate with each retelling, interest that was building toward a crescendo that would soon be impossible to control. The trap was closing, not just around Elias and Lena, but around Silas himself, because once a lie grows large enough, it develops its own momentum. It becomes something that no one person can manage or contain. The paintings that didn't exist were about to become the most talked about art in Virginia, and everyone involved was about to discover that some deceptions are more dangerous than the truth they're meant to conceal. Dr. Hartley arrived at dawn, accompanied by Mr. Brennan and 2 additional observers, a journalist from the Richmond Examiner and a representative from the Virginia Historical Society. The journalist, a young man named Thomas Crawford, carried a notebook and had the eager, hungry expression of someone who sensed a significant story. Silas greeted them on the porch with coffee, real coffee, a luxury he had been hoarding for important occasions. His hands were steady as he poured, but his mind was racing through the plan he had constructed with Lena the night before. Everything depended on timing and misdirection. "Gentlemen, Mrs. Sudden," he said, nodding to the widow who had returned for the 2nd day, "I appreciate your thoroughness. I want there to be no doubt about what you're witnessing." The boys waiting in the studio, they walked to the smokehouse in a group, their breath misting in the cold morning air. Inside, Elias stood beside a blank canvas that had been stretched and primed the previous day. The canvas was positioned on an easel near the window, where morning light fell across it in a clear, even wash. "I'd like to choose a simple subject," Dr. Hartley said, "something that will allow us to observe technique without the complications of complex composition. A single figure, perhaps, or a still life, whatever you prefer," Silas agreed. Hartley considered for a moment, then pointed to a small table in the corner where Silas had arranged several objects: a clay jug, an apple, a piece of bread, a knife. "That arrangement, a traditional still life. It will allow us to assess his understanding of light, shadow, and spatial relationships." Elias looked at the arrangement, then at the blank canvas. Silas could see the boy's throat move as he swallowed nervously. They had rehearsed various scenarios, but a still life presented Partic. Eular challenges. The objects were real present in the room. There would be no opportunity for Lena to pre-paint anything. Elias would have to create something convincing entirely on his own. Or would he? "Before we begin," Silas said, "I should explain the boy's process. He doesn't work continuously. His wrists cause him significant pain, and he needs frequent breaks. Also, he works better without too many people crowding around him. It makes him nervous, affects his concentration. We'll maintain a respectful distance," Hartley said. "But I must insist on continuous observation. No breaks where the boy is left alone with the canvas." Silas had expected this. "Of course, though I would ask that you allow him some privacy during his rest periods. He's still a child, and this level of scrutiny is difficult for him." It was a delicate negotiation, and Silas could see Hartley weighing his desire for scientific rigor against his sympathy for a disabled child. Finally, the professor nodded. "We'll observe in shifts, at least 2 people in the room at all times, but we'll rotate to avoid overwhelming him." It wasn't perfect, but it gave Silas the opening he needed. Elias began to work. He picked up a piece of charcoal and began sketching the outlines of the still life on the canvas. His movements were slow, careful. The stumps of his wrists gripped the charcoal with visible effort. The sketch that emerged was crude but recognizable. The proportions were roughly correct. The spatial relationships were plausible. It was the work of someone with basic observational skills, but no formal training, exactly what one would expect from a self-taught child. The observers watched in fascination. Mrs. Sutton was crying again. Crawford was scribbling notes. Brennan was studying Elias's technique with professional interest. After an hour, Elias set down the charcoal and stepped back from the canvas. He was breathing heavily, and Silas could see genuine exhaustion in his face. The boy had been working with intense concentration, and it had taken a toll. "He needs a break," Silas said. "Just 15 minutes, some water and rest." Hartley hesitated, then nodded. "Very well, but the canvas remains here, and 2 of us will stay in the room." "Of course," Silas agreed. He led Elias outside, leaving Hartley and Brennan to watch over the canvas. This was the critical moment. Silas walked Elias to a small shed behind the smokehouse, ostensibly to give him privacy and rest, but actually to execute the next phase of the plan. Lena was waiting inside the shed. She had been there since before dawn, hidden, prepared. As soon as Silas and Elias entered, she moved quickly. "Show me your sketch," she whispered to Elias. The boy had memorized every line he had drawn. He described the composition to Lena in quick, quiet detail, where he had placed each object, the proportions he had used, the spatial relationships. Lena listened intently, her mind already translating his crude sketch into something more sophisticated. She had brought a small canvas with her, the same size as the one in the smokehouse. Working with incredible speed, she began to recreate Elias's composition, but with professional skill. Her brushwork was confident, precise. She understood light and shadow, how to model form, how to create the illusion of 3-dimensional objects on a flat surface. She worked for 12 minutes. It wasn't enough time to complete the painting, but it was enough to establish the foundation, the underlying structure that would make everything else possible. When she was done, she had created a still life that was recognizably the same composition Elias had sketched, but executed with a level of skill that seemed impossible for a child. Silas examined her work, his heart pounding. "It's perfect, E whispered. "Now we just need to make the switch." This was the most dangerous part of the plan. They needed to replace the canvas in the smokehouse with the one Lena had just painted, without the observers noticing. It seemed impossible. Hartley and Brennan were watching the original canvas continuously. But Silas had planned for this. He had spent days studying the smokehouse, understanding its layout, identifying its vulnerabilities. The building had two entrances, the main door at the front and a smaller door at the back that had once been used to bring in meat for smoking. The back door opened into a narrow space behind the easel, an area that was partially obscured from the observer's view by the angle of the window light. Lena slipped out of the shed, carrying her canvas wrapped in cloth to protect it. She moved silently to the back door of the smokehouse. Silas had oiled the hinges the night before, and it opened without sound. Inside, Hartley and Brennan were standing near the front of the room, discussing something in low voices. Their attention was on each other, not on the canvas. Lena moved with the speed and precision of someone who had rehearsed this moment a dozen times in her mind. She slipped behind the easel, lifted the original canvas off its supports, and replaced it with her own. The entire operation took perhaps 5 seconds. Then she was gone, disappearing back through the door with the original canvas, leaving no trace of her presence. When Silas and Elias returned to the smokehouse 2 minutes later, Hartley and Brennan were none the wiser. They had been watching the canvas the entire time, or so they believed. They had seen no one enter or leave. The canvas appeared unchanged. Elias returned to work, but now instead of struggling with a crude sketch, he was adding details to a painting that already had professional-level foundation work. He could. Small, careful touches that seemed to improve the image dramatically, because the difficult work had already been done. He added highlights to the apple, refined the shadow of the jug, adjusted the edge of the bread. Each stroke was simple, but because it was building on Lena's sophisticated foundation, the cumulative effect was remarkable. The observers watched in growing amazement. They were seeing what they believed was a disabled child creating professional quality art through sheer force of will and mysterious talent. They were seeing a miracle, but they were seeing a carefully orchestrated illusion. The painting continued over 3 days. Each day followed the same pattern. Elias would work for an hour or two, making visible progress. Then he would take a break, during which Lena would advance the painting significantly in the shed. Then the canvases would be switched, and Elias would return to add finishing touches that made it appear he had done all the work. It was exhausting for everyone involved. Lena was painting for hours each night and during every break, working at a pace that left her hands cramped and her eyes burning. Elias was performing constantly, maintaining his character, never breaking the illusion. And Silas was orchestrating everything, managing the observers, controlling the narrative, living in constant fear that someone would notice an inconsistency. But it was working. By the 3rd day, the still life was complete. It was a remarkable piece of work. Not a masterpiece, but a competent, professional quality painting that demonstrated clear understanding of technique and composition, and everyone who had observed its creation believed they had watched a 12-year-old boy with no hands create it from scratch. Dr. Hartley stood before the finished painting, his expression troubled. "I don't understand how this is possible," he said quietly. "Ever. Everything I know about art and technique tells me this shouldn't exist. And yet, I've watched it being created. I've seen every stroke." "Perhaps," Mrs. Sutton said softly, "we're witnessing something that transcends our understanding. Perhaps this boy has been touched by divine grace." It was exactly the narrative Silas had hoped would emerge. Not a rational explanation, but a mystical one. A story that would allow people to believe in the impossible because they wanted to believe. Crawford, the journalist, was already writing his article in his mind. Silas could see it in the young man's expression, the hunger for a story that would make his career. "This will be front-page news," Crawford said. "The boy who paints like a master, the enslaved child who transcends his circumstances through pure artistic genius. This is exactly the kind of story people need right now. I'd like to purchase several of his works." Mrs. Sutton announced, "For my collection. Name your price, Mr. Thorne." And just like that, the deception had succeeded. The paintings that Lena had created, that Elias had been credited with, were about to become valuable commodities. Silas's plan was working, but success brought new complications because now more people wanted to see the miraculous boy artist. More experts wanted to verify his abilities. More journalists wanted to write about him. The story was spreading beyond Silas's ability to control it. Within a week, Thornhill Plantation was receiving visitors daily, art collectors from Richmond and beyond, curiosity seekers, religious leaders who saw Elias as evidence of God's mysterious ways. Even a photographer who wanted to create a series of images documenting the boy at work. Silas had to perform the canvas switching trick dozens of times, had to coordinate with Lena through increasingly complex signals and timing, had to keep Elias performing his role with consistency. The strain was beginning to show. Lena's hands were developing tremors from overwork. Elias was losing weight, his face becoming gaunt from stress and insufficient sleep. And Silas himself was drinking more, sleeping less, his nerves frayed by the constant fear of exposure. But the money was flowing in. Mrs. Sutton had purchased 3 paintings for a total of $800, more money than Silas had seen in 2 years. Other collectors were making offers. A gallery in Richmond wanted to mount an exhibition. There was talk of sending some of the paintings north to New York and Boston, where they might command even higher prices. Silas was becoming wealthy again. The plantation was being saved. Everything he had hoped for was coming true. So why did he feel like he was standing on the edge of a precipice, waiting for the ground to give way beneath him? The answer came on a Tuesday afternoon in late May, when a man arrived at Thornhill unannounced. He was tall and thin, with the weathered face of someone who had spent years outdoors. He introduced himself as Reverend Marcus Hayes, and he said he had come from a small church in the western part of the state. "I've heard remarkable things about your boy," Hayes said to Silas. "Stories that strain belief. I wanted to see for myself." There was something in the Reverend's tone that made Silas uneasy. Not hostility exactly, but a kind of careful skepticism that suggested this was not a man who would be easily fooled. "You're welcome to observe him working," Silas said, maintaining his practiced hospitality. "Though I should warn you, we've had many visitors lately, and the boy is quite tired." "I won't take much of his time," Hayes said. "I just want to ask him a few questions." This was new. Most visitors had been content to watch Elias work in silence, projecting their own narratives onto him. But Hayes wanted to talk to the boy directly. Silas felt his stomach clench with anxiety. Elias had been coached on what to say if questioned, but those instructions had been basic. Stay quiet, speak only when necessary, let the adults do the talking. But Hayes was persistent. He sat down across from Elias in the smokehouse and looked at him with genuine interest. "What's your name, son?" he asked gently. "Elias," the boy replied quietly. "And how old are you?" 12, sir. When did you start painting?" Elias hesitated, glancing at Silas. They had prepared an answer for this question. "A few years ago, sir. I found some old paints and started trying to use them." "And who taught you?" "Nobody, sir. I just practiced." Hayes nodded slowly. "That's remarkable. Truly remarkable. Can you tell me what you think about when you paint? What you're trying to express?" This was more difficult. Elias had no prepared answer for questions about artistic intent or creative process. He looked at Silas again, his expression uncertain. The boy doesn't always have words for his art. Silas interjected smoothly. "It's more intuitive for him, instinctive." But Hayes kept his eyes on Elias. "I'd like to hear from him if you don't mind." There was a long, uncomfortable silence. Elias's face was carefully neutral, but Silas could see the tension in his shoulders. The boy was trying to think of something to say, something that would sound convincing. "I'd try to make things look real," Elias said finally, "like they do in my head." It was a simple answer, almost childlike, but there was something about the way Elias said it, a kind of quiet sincerity that seemed to satisfy Hayes. "Thank you," the Reverend said. He stood and turned to Silas. "I'd like to see more of his work if possible." Silas showed him the paintings in the gallery. Hayes examined each one carefully, his expression unreadable. When he was finished, he turned to Silas with a slight SM. "These are extraordinary," he said, "truly extraordinary. But I have to tell you, Mr. Thorne, I'm troubled by something." Silas's heart began to pound. "What's that?" "I've been a minister for 20 years, Hayes said. "I've counsel-led hundreds of people, listened to thousands of confessions, and I've developed a sense for when someone is hiding something, when there's a truth that isn't being spoken." He let the words hang in the air. Silas forced himself to remain calm, to keep his expression neutral. "I don't know what that truth is," Hayes continued. "Maybe it's something innocent. Maybe it's something more complicated. But I want you to know that I'm going to be watching. And if there's deception here, if this boy is being exploited in some way, I will expose it." It wasn't quite an accusation, but it was close enough to make Silas's blood run cold. "There's no deception," Silas said firmly. "Everything you've heard is true. The boy has a remarkable gift, and I'm simply helping him share it with the world." Hayes studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded. "I hope that's true, Mr. Thorne, for your sake and for his." After the Reverend left, Silas stood alone in the gallery, staring at the paintings that had brought him wealth and attention and were now threatening to bring him ruin. Because Hayes was right, there was deception, elaborate, ongoing deception that required constant maintenance and was becoming harder to sustain with each passing day. And if someone like Hayes, someone with moral authority and public credibility, decided to investigate seriously, the entire structure would collapse. Silas poured himself a drink with shaking hands. He had wanted success. He had gotten it. But success had brought scrutiny, and scrutiny was the one thing his deception couldn't survive. He needed to find a way to end this, to cash out, disappear before the truth emerged. But how? The paintings were becoming famous. Elias was becoming famous. There was no graceful exit. He was trapped in the lie he had created, and he was beginning to suspect that the only way out was through catastrophe. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Thornhill intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content. And don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in this web of deception that's about to unravel in the most devastating way possible. The exhibition opened in Richmond on June 15, 1865. The gallery was one of the few buildings in the city that had survived the evacuation fires relatively intact. A three-story structure on Franklin Street that had once hosted the cream of Confederate society. Now it was hosting something different. 17 paintings attributed to a 12-year-old formerly enslaved boy with no hands. The opening night drew a crowd of over 200 people. Union officers in blue uniforms mingled with former Confederate families, still wearing mourning black. Northern journalists rubbed shoulders with Richmond society matrons. Everyone wanted to see the miraculous paintings. Everyone wanted to be part of the story. Silas stood near the entrance, accepting congratulations and deflecting questions. He had dressed carefully for the occasion in his best remaining suit. His hair paraded, his expression carefully calibrated to project humble pride. He was the benevolent former master who had recognized genius in an unlikely place, the man who had given opportunity to someone the old system would have kept invisible. It was a role he played well, but inside he was terrified because Elias was there. Silas had been forced to bring him, to have him present as living proof of the painting's authenticity. The boy stood in a corner of the gallery wearing clean clothes that Silas had purchased for the occasion, his wrists clearly visible, his face carefully neutral. People approached him constantly. They wanted to touch him as if his disability might be contagious or miraculous. They wanted to hear him speak to confirm that he was real. They wanted to stare at his wrists and imagine how those stumps could possibly create such beauty. Elias endured it all with remarkable composure. But Silas could see the strain in the boy's eyes, the exhaustion, the barely suppressed resentment. Lena was not there. She remained at Thornhill, hidden, erased from the narrative. Silas had given her $50, a fraction of what he had earned from the paintings, and told her to stay quiet, to let the story play out, to wait for her share of the profits that he had no intention of actually providing. The reviews in the newspapers the next day were rapturous. "A miracle of art and human spirit," declared the Richmond Examiner. "The boy who paints like Rembrandt," proclaimed the Richmond Whig. "Evidence of divine providence in dark times." suggested the religious herald. The paintings sold quickly. Mrs. Sutton purchased 3 more. A Union general bought 2 for his home in Massachusetts. A wealthy merchant from Baltimore acquired 4. Within a week, Silas had earned over $3,000, more money than he had made in the previous 5 years combined. But the success brought intensified scrutiny. More experts wanted to examine the paintings, more journalists wanted to interview Elias, and Reverend Hayes had not gone away. He had returned to Thornhill twice more, asking questions, watching carefully, his skepticism growing more pointed. "I've been making inquiries," Hayes told Silas during his 3rd visit, "talking to people who were here before the war, asking about the boy's history. And what have you learned?" Silas asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "That nobody remembers seeing him paint before this year," Hayes said. "That he was assigned to garden work and was never observed showing any artistic inclination. That the paintings only appeared after you began having financial difficulties. The boy kept his talent hidden. Silas said he was afraid of being punished for wasting time. It's only after emancipation that he felt free to express himself. It was a plausible explanation." But Hayes didn't look convinced. "There's something else," the Reverend said. "I've been examining the paintings carefully, and I've noticed something interesting. The style varies significantly between works. Some show influences from Italian Baroque, others have elements of Dutch Golden Age technique. It's as if they were painted by someone with extensive knowledge of European art history." Silas felt sweat forming on his back. "The boy has a natural gift for absorbing and replicating styles," he said. "It's part of what makes him remarkable." Or Hayes said quietly, "Someone with that knowledge is helping him. Someone who has studied European masters, someone who might have traveled abroad and seen these works firsthand." The implication was clear. Hayes was suggesting that Silas himself was involved in the creation of the paintings. It was close to the truth, but not quite accurate. And that small gap between suspicion and reality was the only thing protecting Silas. "I'm not an artist, Reverend," Silas said firmly. "I can barely draw a straight line. You're welcome to test me if you doubt that. I don't think you're painting them," Hayes said. "But I think someone is, and I think you know who." Before Silas could respond, they were interrupted by the arrival of another visitor, a man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as Mr. Jonathan Pierce, an art dealer from New York City. "I've come to make you an offer," Pierce said to Silas. "I want to take the boy on tour. New York, Boston, Philadelphia, maybe even Europe eventually. We'll stage demonstrations of his work, sell paintings to the highest bidders. I'm prepared to offer you a very generous contract." It was everything Silas had dreamed of. National exposure, serious money, the opportunity to escape Virginia and the ghosts of his failed past. But it was also impossible because a tour would mean constant scrutiny, daily demonstrations, no opportunity for the careful choreography that made the deception work. The fraud would be exposed within days, maybe hours. "I need to think about it," Silas said. "Don't think too long," Pice replied. "I have other opportunities. But this boy, if he's real, could make us both very wealthy men." That phrase, "if he's real," hung in the air like a threat. After Pierce left, Silas walked back to Thornhill alone, his mind churning. He was trapped between escalating success and inevitable exposure. Every new opportunity brought new risks. Every new admirer brought new scrutiny. He needed to end this, but he didn't know how. When he arrived at the plantation, he found Lena waiting for him on the porch of the main house. She had never come to the main house before. Her presence there was a violation of the unspoken rules that governed their relationship. "We need to talk," she said. Her voice was quiet but firm. They went inside to the gallery where the remaining paintings hung. Lena stood before one of them, a depiction of the prodigal son that she had painted in a single night, working until her hands bled. "I'm done," she said. Silas felt his stomach drop. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I'm not painting anymore. I'm not helping you with this deception. It's gone too far." "You can't stop now," Silas said, trying to keep his voice calm. "We're so close to what?" Lena interrupted. "To you getting rich while I stay invisible, to Elias being paraded around like a circus attraction, to this lie consuming all of us. I promised you money." Silas said. "A share of the profits, enough to start a new life. You've given me $50. Lena said. "You've made thousands, and you have no intention of giving me more, do you?" Silas didn't answer. He couldn't because she was right. "I want half," Lena said. "Half of everything you've made and everything you're going to make, and I want it in writing, a legal contract." "That's impossible," Silas said. "If I acknowledge your role, the entire deception collapses. The paintings become worthless. We all lose everything." "Then we all lose everything," Lena said, "because I'm not painting anymore unless you agree to my terms." They stared at each other across the gallery. The paintings Lena had created surrounded them, silent witnesses to the exploitation that had produced them. "You're making a mistake," Silas said quietly. "You have no power here, no legal standing. If you try to expose this, who will believe you?" A former slave accusing her former master in Virginia in 1865. "Maybe nobody will believe me," Lena said, "but I'll tell the truth anyway to the newspapers, to Reverend Hayes, to anyone who will listen. And even if they don't believe me, the doubt will be enough. The paintings will be tainted. Your reputation will be destroyed." It was a threat, a real one. And Silas realized with cold clarity that Lena was serious. She had reached her breaking point. "What do you want?" he asked. "I told you half of everything in writing and freedom to leave whenever I choose, and if I agree, then I'll paint one more series, enough to fulfill your current contracts. After that, I'm done. You can figure out what to do with Elias on your own." Silas considered his options. He could refuse, try to force Lena to continue, but she had made clear she was willing to destroy everything rather than continue being exploited. He could try to discredit her preemptively, spread rumors that she was mentally unstable or vindictive, but that carried its own risks. Or he could agree to her terms, at least temporarily, buy himself time to figure out a more permanent solution. "All right," he said finally, "half in writing, but you have to continue for at least 2 more months. I have commitments, contracts, I need time to fulfill them." Lena studied him, clearly suspicious, but she nodded. 2 months? Then I'm leaving with or without your permission." After she left, Silas poured himself a drink and sat in the darkening gallery. The painting stared down at him, beautiful and accusatory. He had created this situation, had set in motion forces he couldn't control, and now those forces were turning against him. He thought about Hayes's suspicions, about Pierce's offer, about Lena's ultimatum, about Elias, who was growing older and more aware, who might at any moment decide to speak the truth. The deception was collapsing. Not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly, inexorably, like a building with a cracked foundation gradually settling into ruin. Silas needed a way out, a solution that would preserve his wealth and reputation while ending the charade before it destroyed him. And as he sat there in the darkness, surrounded by paintings that represented both his salvation and his damnation, an idea began to form. A terrible idea. An idea that would require him to cross a line he had never crossed before. But he was desperate, and desperate men do desperate things. The next morning, Silas rode into Richmond and met with a lawyer. He had the contract drawn up as promised, a document giving Lena half of all proceeds from the paintings. He signed it and had it witnessed. But he also did something else. He visited a doctor he knew, a man who had fallen on hard times and was willing to do things that more respectable physicians would refuse. "I need a medical certificate," Silas said, stating that a certain individual is mentally unstable, prone to delusions and false accusations, not to be trusted. The doctor studied him. "This is about the painting boy, isn't it? The rumors. It's about protecting the truth," Silas said. "There's someone who wants to destroy something beautiful out of jealousy and spite. I need documentation that will discredit her if she tries her." The doctor asked. Silas nodded. "A former slave. She's claiming she painted the works herself. It's obviously false, but she's persistent. I need insurance." The doctor considered for a moment, then named his price. Silas paid it. 2 days later he had his certificate, a document declaring Lena to be of unsound mind, her statements unreliable, her accusations the product of delusion. It was a weapon. Insurance against the day when Lena might try to expose the truth. But it was also something darker. a preemptive attack on the credibility of the one person who could destroy him, a way of ensuring that even if she spoke the truth, nobody would believe her. Silas told himself he was just being prudent, protecting his interests, doing what any reasonable businessman would do. But he knew in the part of himself he tried not to examine too closely that he had crossed a line, that he was no longer just deceiving people about the origin of some paintings. He was actively working to destroy someone's credibility, to render her voiceless, to ensure that her truth could never compete with his lie. He was becoming the villain of his own story, and he couldn't seem to stop. At Thornhill, Elias sat in the smokehouse and stared at a blank canvas. He had been told to practice to maintain his performance skills, but he was tired. Tired of pretending, tired of being stared at, tired of being used. He thought about Lena, who had taught him small things over the past months, how to really look at objects to see their shapes and shadows, how to think about composition. She had been kind to him in her quiet way, had treated him like a person rather than a prop. He wondered what would happen to her, to both of them when this all fell apart, and he was increasingly certain it would fall apart. What would become of the people Silas had used to build his lie? Elias was 12 years old, but he had learned hard lessons about how the world worked, about power and exploitation, about how some people's stories were believed while others were dismissed, about how disability and race could make you invisible or hypervisible depending on what served the powerful. He didn't have a plan. He was too young, too powerless. But he was watching, learning, waiting, and he was beginning to understand that sometimes the only way to escape a trap is to spring it yourself, even if you get hurt in the process. The summer heat was yielding. The tobacco fields around Thornhill low and overgrown, and in Richmond, in galleries and parlours and newspaper offices, people continued to talk about the miraculous boy who painted like a master. The lie had taken on a life of its own. It no longer needed Silas to sustain it. It was sustained by everyone who wanted to believe in miracles, in redemption, in the possibility that something beautiful could emerge from suffering. But lies, no matter how beautiful, eventually collide with truth. And when they do, the collision is rarely gentle. That collision was coming. Everyone involved could feel it. The tension was building like a summer's storm, the air growing heavy and electric, the sky darkening with the promise of violence. And when the storm finally broke, it would sweep away everything in its path. The fire started on a Thursday night in late July. Later, people would disagree about how it began. Some said it was an accident, a candle left burning in the smokehouse. Others whispered about arson, about someone deliberately destroying evidence. A few suggested divine judgment, God's punishment for deception and exploitation. But whatever the cause, the result was undeniable. By the time anyone noticed the flames, the smokehouse was fully engulfed. The fire spread quickly to the nearby storage buildings, then to the slave quarters, then to the main house itself. Silas woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of shouting. He stumbled out of bed, his mind foggy with sleep and alcohol. He had been drinking more heavily in recent weeks, trying to quiet the anxiety that gnawed at him constantly. By the time he reached the porch, half the plantation was burning. The sky was orange with reflected flames. People were running in all directions, trying to save what they could, calling out for missing family members. "Where's Elias?" Silas shouted to anyone who would. "Listen, where's the boy?" Nobody knew. In the chaos, the boy had disappeared. Silas ran toward the smokehouse, but the heat drove him back. The building was a roaring inferno, the flames so intense that he couldn't get within 20 feet. If anyone was inside, they were already dead. "Lena," he called out. "Has anyone seen Lena?" But she was gone too. Her quarters were empty, her few possessions missing. She had vanished some time before the fire started, taking with her the contract Silas had signed and whatever else she could carry. The fire burned through the night. By dawn, most of Thornhill Plantation was reduced to smoking ruins. The main house was a blackened shell. The smokehouse was completely gone along with any paintings that had been stored there. The slave quarters were destroyed, and Elias was missing. Silas stood in the ashes as the sun rose, his face blackened with soot, his eyes red from smoke and exhaustion. Everything he had worked for was gone. The paintings that remained were in Richmond, but without Elias to continue the story, without the ability to produce new works, their value would plummet. The deception was over. But worse than the financial loss was the uncertainty. Where was Elias? Had he died in the fire? Had he run away? And where was Lena? Reverend Hayes arrived at midday, accompanied by several men from his church. They had come to help with the aftermath, to provide aid to the displaced people who had lived at Thornhill. Hayes found Silas sitting on what remained of the porch steps, staring at the ruins. "I'm sorry for your loss," the Reverend said. There was genuine sympathy in his voice, but also something else, something that sounded like vindication. "It's gone," Silas said dully. "All of it." "Perhaps that's for the best," Hayes said quietly. "Perhaps this is God's way of ending something that should never have begun." Silas looked up at him. "You think I started the fire?" "I think the truth has a way of emerging," Hayes said. "One way or another." Over the following days, the story began to unravel. A journalist from the Richmond Examiner came to interview Silas about the fire and left with more questions than answers. Why had Lena disappeared the same night? Where was Elias? And why were there reports from some of the other formerly enslaved people at Thornhill that they had seen Lena painting in the smokehouse late at night? Silas tried to maintain the narrative, tried to explain away the inconsistencies, but without Elias, without the ability to demonstrate the boy's supposed talent, the story lost its power. Art experts began re-examining the paintings in Richmond with more critical eyes. They noticed the inconsistencies that Hayes had pointed out, the varying styles, the sophisticated knowledge of European art history, the technical skills that seemed impossible for a self-taught child. Doubts spread. Collectors who had paid premium prices began demanding refunds. The gallery that had hosted the exhibition distanced itself from the works. Newspapers that had celebrated the miraculous boy artist now ran stories questioning the authenticity of the paintings. And then, 3 weeks after the fire, a letter arrived at the offices of the Richmond Examiner. It was written in careful, educated handwriting and signed by someone named Lena Thorne, claiming to be the illegitimate daughter of Silas's father and the true artist behind the paintings attributed to Elias. The letter detailed everything: the deception, the exploitation, the carefully orchestrated performances, the canvas switching, the way Silas had used both Lena and Elias to perpetrate a fraud. She included the contract Silas had signed, acknowledging her role and promising her half the proceeds. She included sketches and studies that matched the finished par. Intings proving her artistic skill. She included testimony from other people who had lived at Thornhill, confirming that they had seen her painting. The letter was devastating, comprehensive, undeniable. Silas tried to fight back. He produced the medical certificate declaring Lena mentally unstable. He claimed she was lying out of jealousy and spite. He insisted that the paintings were genuine works by Elias, that Lena was simply trying to steal credit for someone else's genius. But nobody believed him. The evidence was too strong, the pattern too clear, and Silas's own desperation made him seem guilty. Within a month, he was ruined. Not just financially, though he was certainly that, with collectors demanding refunds and threatening lawsuits, but socially, he became a pariah in Richmond society. The man who had exploited a disabled child and an illegitimate daughter to perpetrate a fraud. The man who had lied about art and redemption and human transcendence. He tried to find Lena to convince her to recant, to offer her more money, but she had disappeared completely. Some said she had gone north to Philadelphia or New York. Others claimed she had traveled west, starting a new life under a new name. Nobody knew for certain. And Elias, the boy, remained missing for 2 months. Then, in September, a dispatch arrived from a Freedmen's Bureau office in Washington, D.C. It was a thread of hope in the dark. A boy matching Elias's description had walked in off the street, looking for help. He told the officials he had escaped a plantation in Virginia. He told them he had been forced to participate in a lie. The Bureau sent an investigator. The boy sat across from him and confirmed every word of Lena's account. He described the rehearsals, the performances, the way Silas had used him as a prop, a living easel, while Lena did the actual work. He spoke without anger, without tears. Jade asked the flat, unvarnished truth. The investigator asked him what he wanted now. To learn, Elias said. To go to school. To read and write properly. Maybe to really learn to paint someday. If I can... The Bureau placed him with a family in Washington who ran a school for freed children. And just like that, he vanished into a new life, leaving the miracle behind. Silas remained at Thornhill, or what was left of it. He had nowhere else to go, no money to rebuild, no reputation left to trade on. He lived in a small cabin that had survived the fire, a hovel rising from the ashes. He grew vegetables, sold what little he could, and slowly, methodically, drank himself into oblivion. Reverend Hayes visited him once, months after the world had turned its back. "Why did you do it?" Hayes asked. "You must have known it would fall apart." Silas stared at the floor. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. "I thought I could control it," Silas finally rasped. "I thought I was smart enough to manage the deception, to keep all the pieces in place. You were exploiting people, Silas, using them, erasing Lena's work and forcing that boy to live a lie. Didn't that haunt you?" "Of course it haunted me," Silas snapped, "but I told myself it was necessary, that we were all benefiting, that the ends justified the means." He let out a bitter, cracking laugh. "The things we tell ourselves, to justify what we want to do anyway. What will you do now?" "I don't know," Silas said, his voice hollow. "Wait here until I die, I suppose. There's nothing else left." Hayes stood to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth, Mr. Thorne, I don't think you're an evil man, just a desperate one who made terrible choices. I hope you find some peace." But peace was a ghost. Silas lived for another 3 years. He died in 1868. The doctor called it heart failure, but everyone knew it was despair. He was buried in the family plot at Thornhill, next to his wife and sons. His gravestone bears only his name and dates, no epitaph, no summary of a life, just the cold arithmetic of his existence. The paintings, however, they had a strange afterlife. Once the fraud was exposed, most collectors tried to burn them or return them. They were ashamed, but a few kept them, fascinated. Not by the lie of the miraculous boy, but by the true story etched into the canvas, the story of Lena's stolen genius. Over the years, as the world began to wake up, as people started looking for the artistic contributions of Black Americans that had been erased, Lena's work found a new audience. Art historians hunted the paintings down. They studied the brushstrokes. They pieced together her biography from whispers and fragments. They learned she had gone north, to Philadelphia. She continued painting under her own name. She never became famous, the world wasn't ready for that, but she lived. She married, had children, taught art to other freed people. She died in 1891, at age 52. Her obituary mentioned a scandal in Virginia, then dismissed it, focusing instead on her life as an educator, a leader, a builder of community. A few of her paintings survived. They hang in small museums now. They aren't masterpieces, but they are good, honest. The work of someone who loved light and composition, who pursued her art in spite of everything. Elias's story is harder to trace. The Bureau records are incomplete, but there are hints. A man named Joshua Norton appears in the 1870 census in Washington, D.C. Age matches, location matches, listed as a teacher at a school for black children. If it's him, and historians believe it is, he lived a long, quiet life. He married, he had a family, he worked in education for 30 years. There is no record of him ever painting again, but school archives mention his particular skill in teaching, drawing, and observation. He died in 1911. His death certificate lists his occupation as educator. And there, in the margin, a detail that breaks your heart, missing both hands. A disability he had lived with for over 50 years. He adapted, he thrived. The story of the paintings that shouldn't exist became a footnote, a cautionary tale. But it's also a story about survival, about two people used as props in someone else's narrative, who eventually grabbed the pen and wrote their own ending. In 2015, a small exhibition opened in Richmond. The Invisible Artist Lena Thorne and the Thornhill Plantation Fraud. It told the real story. It drew modest crowds. And in the guest book, someone wrote, "These paintings are beautiful, but the story behind them is a reminder that beauty can emerge from terrible circumstances and that the truth, however painful, is always worth telling." That's the right place to end this. Not with easy answers, but with the acknowledgement that history is messy, that the stories we tell are often lies we tell ourselves. The boy who painted like Rembrandt never existed. He was a ghost, a construct. But the woman who held the brush, she did exist, and the child who stood beside her, who endured the gaze of 1,000 strangers, who escaped and built a life of dignity, he existed too. Their story, the true story, is the one that deserves to be remembered. Not the miracle, the reality, because the paintings remain. 17 canvases, beautiful but tainted, valuable but troubling, silent witnesses to a fraud that fooled Virginia and to the real talents of people who were almost erased, somewhere in the archives. In the dust of census records and freedmen's documents, their traces remain. 2 people who were used as tools, but who ultimately quietly reclaimed their souls. The lie is dead. The truth is what survives.